It was my own grandson who looked me in the eye and said, "You're not a real man." The words didn't just land in the air, they detonated inside me. For a moment, even the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. I heard the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, the scrape of a fork against a plate, the soft laughter of children in another room. But none of it could cover what he had just said. He was staring at me as if testing his strength, as if my worth could be erased by a sentence thrown carelessly across the table. And then came the silence. Not the silence of shock. Not the silence that rises when people rush to protect someone who has been wronged. This was the silence of complicity. My son avoided my eyes, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth as though it held the answers he didn't dare speak. My daughter-in-law pursed her lips, pretending she hadn't heard. The others shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. That silence weighed more than the insult. It was as if the whole room agreed with him, as if the truth of my life could be summed up in his words. Not a real man. I felt it in my chest, sharp and unforgiving. My mind raced back through the years. The decades of hard work that had left my hands calloused and my back bent. The endless nights when I worked until dawn to keep this family fed, to keep the roof over our heads, to make sure they had the opportunities I never had. The moments of quiet pride, when I saw my son graduate, when I held my grandson for the first time, when I thought, this is what it means to be a man, to give without asking, to love without limit. And yet, here I was, being told by the boy I had once cradled in my arms that I was less than that. I wanted to rise from my chair, slam my fist on the table, and shout, "Do you know what it cost me to stand here today? Do you know the nights I bled so that you could eat? Do you know the times I broke myself in silence just so you could feel safe?" But my mouth refused to open. My pride, the same pride that had carried me through storms and sleepless years, sealed my lips, because I understood something in that instant. Arguing with him, defending myself to him, would only cheapen the truth. He would not understand now, not when he was young, arrogant, and blind to the weight of sacrifice. A man who must explain why he is a man to a child is no man at all. So I sat in my chair, my face calm though my chest burned, and I let the insult hang in the air. But deep inside something shifted. The words didn't break me. They lit a fire, a quiet, steady fire that told me, "You don't need to fight with words. One day he will see. One day he will understand what kind of man you are, not because you told him, but because the truth will speak for itself." And in that moment, though my family had turned away, I made a silent promise to myself. I would let time be my witness. I would let my actions, the ones already written in stone and brick in every life I had touched, rise above their blindness. And when that day came, when truth walked into the room uninvited, no one would ever again dare to call me anything less than what I was. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now we continue. I sat there long after the words had been spoken, long after the plates had been cleared, and the voices of my family had turned to other things, leaving me alone with the echo of what had been said. My grandson had gone back to scrolling his phone, his jaw set in that careless pride of youth, and yet his words still burned in my ears. Not a real man. It wasn't just a momentary insult. It was a verdict, a branding iron pressed into my skin by the very blood that carried my name. I looked at him, this boy who bore my family's features, and yet in his eyes there was no recognition. He didn't see me as a man who had built, sacrificed, endured. He saw only an old shadow sitting at the table. To him, I was not strength but weakness, not proof of endurance but evidence of decline. In the gaze of the young, the past shrivels into irrelevance, and all that matters is what they think they see now. And what he saw was a bent figure, a man whose hands shook when he lifted his cup, whose steps were slower than they once were. But he could not see the weight those hands had carried, or the miles those steps had walked. He could not see the nights I had spent alone in the cold, working jobs that tore my body apart, so that my son, his father, would never go hungry. He could not see the moments when I had chosen silence instead of anger, peace instead of pride, just to hold this family together. To him, those sacrifices were invisible, because the young believe that strength is loud and obvious, not quiet and enduring. I watched as my son, my own flesh and blood, avoided my eyes again. His silence hurt worse than my grandson's words. Perhaps he was ashamed of me too. Perhaps he had long ago grown tired of explaining to others why his father no longer stood tall, why his father's hands shook. Maybe to him as well, I had become little more than a shadow in the house I had helped build, a presence tolerated but not honored, and that realization was heavier than anything. Because the truth is, it isn't the insult of a child that breaks a man, it's the silence of his son. When the one you raised refuses to stand by you, you begin to feel like a ghost in your own bloodline. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought of everything I'd given. My body, my years, my pride, poured out like water into the soil of this family. And yet here I was, dismissed as not a real man. I felt like a photograph left too long in the sun, my edges fading, my colors washed away, until only a pale outline remained. But inside me something stirred again. That same fire from before, only now deeper, quieter, more dangerous. If they saw me as a shadow, then one day they would see how wrong they were, for shadows only exist because light stands somewhere nearby. And though they thought I was fading, the truth was that my light had never gone out. It was burning where they refused to look. One day, I promised myself, the boy who spat those words at me would learn what manhood truly meant, and he would not learn it from lectures or raised voices. He would learn it when the truth he never saw rose up in front of him, undeniable, unshakable. Then and only then would he understand who I was. There are moments in life when silence wounds more than any weapon, when the absence of a word cuts deeper than the sharpest insult. That night, after my grandson's careless cruelty, I waited, not for an apology from him, for youth rarely understands the gravity of what it says, but for a word, a gesture, anything from my son or his wife. I waited for them to stand between me and that wound, to remind the boy that respect runs deeper than arrogance, that family is built on honor. But the silence never broke. My son sat across the table, his eyes fixed on the rim of his glass, avoiding mine as though looking at me would burn him. My daughter-in-law adjusted the plates with a cold precision, her lips pressed into a line that said more than words ever could. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them offered even the smallest defense. Their silence was agreement, and in that moment, the room grew heavier, the air thick with betrayal. I'd faced many things in life, hunger, labor, illness, storms that nearly broke my body, but nothing compared to that quiet dismissal from those who should have stood beside me. The insult of my grandson was just the spark. Their silence was the fire. It consumed me from within, a slow burn that ate away at dignity, leaving only ashes of doubt. I thought back to the years when my son was small, when he had once looked at me with wide, trusting eyes, when my hands had lifted him onto my shoulders, so he could see a world that seemed too big for him. Back then, he believed I was unshakable, a man who could move mountains with bare hands. But now, sitting at the same table, he could not find the courage to speak even one word in my defense. Somewhere along the way, his admiration had withered into embarrassment, and that realization cut deeper than any insult from a boy. It is a peculiar kind of loneliness, the kind that comes not from being abandoned physically, but from being erased in plain sight. To sit among your own family and feel like an unwelcome stranger, a burden to be endured, rather than a pillar to be honored. I saw it in their eyes, the wish that I would fade quietly into the background, that I would take my frailty and my memories somewhere far away. They thought time had stripped me of worth, that I was no longer a man to be defended, but an inconvenience to be tolerated. I lowered my gaze, not in shame, but in grief, because I realized then that the war I was fighting was not with words, but with erasure. They weren't trying to hurt me with insults. They were trying to bury me with silence. That was their cruelty. That was their betrayal. Yet even in that moment of humiliation, something steadied within me. If they thought their silence could erase me, they were mistaken. Silence cannot rewrite truth. Silence cannot undo the foundations laid with sweat and sacrifice. One day, the very people who sat in judgment of me would learn that manhood is not proven in youth's arrogance or in the approval of others. It is proven in endurance, in the quiet strength to stand even when no one stands beside you. And so I remained at that table still and quiet, not because I accepted their verdict, but because I knew the story was not finished. That night, long after the voices in the house had quieted, I sat alone with the weight of years pressing against me. My grandson's insult, my son's silence, my daughter-in-law's indifference, they all seemed to declare in unison that my life had been emptied of meaning. But as the night stretched on, memory began to move within me, not as comfort, but as truth refusing to be buried. I remembered the decades when my hands bled, not from accident, but from labor so relentless it carved its mark into bone. I had built walls with those hands, lifted beams that seemed impossible for one man, endured winters where the cold sank into my lungs like fire. Those weren't just years of survival, they were years of creation. Brick by brick, line by line, decision after decision, I had forged not only homes and roads, but the very path my family now walked on without seeing it beneath their feet. It wasn't just muscle I gave. My mind had been a second set of tools. I spent countless nights hunched over a worn desk, scribbling numbers on paper, planning, calculating, solving problems no one else dared to face. My thoughts built bridges across obstacles. My ideas opened doors they now walked through as if those doors had always been open. Each sacrifice, each plan, was a stitch in the fabric of a future they wore without ever asking where it had come from. And yet, what stung most was not the work itself. It was the heart I had poured into it. Because every long shift, every sleepless night, every coin I saved, I did not save for myself. I did it so that my son would never feel hunger as I once had. I did it so that my grandson could live in a house filled with warmth and never know the fear of an empty table. I did it so that this family, my family, would have a foundation strong enough to withstand storms. My life had been one long offering, given quietly with no demand for recognition. But memory is a cruel and noble thing. It gives life to what others try to erase. Sitting there in the dark, I could see my sacrifices as clearly as the scars on my hands. Yet in my own home, in the presence of my own blood, those sacrifices were invisible. To them, I was not the man who carried them across the years. I was only a frail figure, shuffling slower than the rest, occupying space they wished was empty. Invisible, that was the word that clung to me. A man can endure hardship, loss, even betrayal, but to become invisible in the eyes of those he gave everything for, that is a wound without bandages. They had forgotten that every brick in these walls bore my fingerprints, that every meal they ate was born of hours I had spent working with an empty stomach, that every comfort they now claimed as ordinary had once been bought with my sweat. And still, though they had forgotten, I had not. The truth cannot be erased simply because it is ignored. It lives in the foundations, in the structures, in the history that no one can rewrite. They might treat me as a shadow now, but the reality was different. I was the ground beneath their feet, unseen but essential. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, not a plea, not a prayer, but a promise. If they would not remember, then life itself would remind them. And when that day came, the silence that betrayed me tonight would not be enough to hide the truth. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the house fell into silence. The walls around me breathed with the sounds of sleep from others, but inside me there was no rest. There was only the echo, sharp, cruel, endless, of my grandson's words. You're not a real man. Over and over it struck like a hammer inside my skull. each repetition heavier, colder, until it seemed my own heartbeat had taken on the rhythm of that insult. I turned on my side, then back again, but there was no escape. My body was tired, yes, but my mind refused to close its eyes. The words were not just an insult from a boy. They had become a stone lodged in my chest, a weight pressing down on me so deeply I could not draw a full breath. It was not the sting of disrespect alone that crushed me. It was something worse. It was the thought that the truth, the real measure of my life, my labor, my sacrifices, had been erased so completely that even my own blood could not see it. That was the wound, not the insult itself, but the emptiness behind it. How could they look at me and see nothing? How could they forget that manhood is not defined by what is loud and shining, but by what is endured in silence? How could they not know that a man's worth is not in the weight of his words, but in the weight he has carried for others? I remembered nights when I had come home with my hands raw, fingers cracked open, back screaming in pain. Yet I still stood, still worked, still pressed forward because my family depended on me. I remembered winters when I gave away my coat so that my son could be warm, times when I kept hunger to myself so his plate could be full. I remembered sacrifices no one had ever asked me to make, sacrifices no one had ever seen, because I had not made them for glory. I had made them out of love. And now, lying awake, that love felt like a cruel joke. Because what good is love if it leaves you invisible? What good is sacrifice if it leaves you branded as less than a man? My grandson could not see the truth, but neither could my son. And that was the thought that carved deepest into my chest. That silence, that lack of defense, was confirmation that somewhere along the years my worth had been misplaced in their eyes. I pressed my hand against my heart as though I could push the stone out of it, but it stayed, heavy, cold, refusing to move. It reminded me that my life story had been written in ink too faint for them to read, or perhaps in a language they no longer cared to understand. And so, in their eyes, I had become no one, a man stripped of his history, reduced to a frail figure sitting too long in a chair. Yet as the night dragged on, another thought came, slow but steady. Perhaps the stone was not there to crush me, but to anchor me. Perhaps it was a reminder that truth does not vanish because others are blind to it. Perhaps one day, when the right moment came, that truth would break free, sharp and undeniable, and they would have no choice but to see what had always been there. I closed my eyes, not in peace but in quiet defiance. If they thought I was not a man, they had not yet learned what true strength was. Sleep never came, but memory did. Not the kind of memory that burns with bitterness, but the kind that holds the quiet truth no insult can erase. As I lay in the dark, I let my mind wander back to the years when my strength was not spent arguing or proving myself, but building something no one knew about. Something that mattered more than recognition, more than titles, more even than family pride. There was a time when every coin I earned seemed already claimed before it reached my hand. My son thought the money went into debts, bills, or simply vanished into the cracks of old age. My grandson assumed I had nothing left because I had wasted it. But the truth was different. Each coin, each saved dollar was carried like a seed and planted where no one could see. I gave them not to banks or to my own comfort, but to a vision that lived in my chest, a clinic, standing in the heart of our city, where people with nothing could finally have a chance. I remembered those meetings in small offices where the walls smelled of fresh paint and cheap coffee. I remembered handing envelopes across desks, shaking hands with men and women who promised me that the dream would grow. They asked me if I wanted my name carved into the cornerstone, if I wanted recognition when the doors opened. I told them no, I didn't need glory. I wanted something stronger than glory. I wanted healing. I wanted mercy. I wanted children to be born safely, the sick to find medicine, the broken to find care, even if they never knew whose sacrifices had made it possible. For years I had lived a double life. To my family, I was a tired old man, sitting quietly at the edge of dinners, speaking little, owning less. But outside those walls, I was the silent benefactor of something larger than myself. When they thought I was at home napping, I was at city council meetings. When they assumed I was wasting my pension, I was signing checks that kept the construction going. When they thought I was wasting space, I was building a space where life itself would be saved. I could still see the faces of the workers pouring the foundation, men in hard hats who greeted me with respect, though I asked them not to tell anyone who I was. I could still hear the echo of hammers, the clatter of scaffolding, the smell of wet cement rising into the morning air. Every brick that was laid carried a piece of my own heart with it. No one in my family ever saw me there, but that didn't matter, because the truth of a man is not always what is visible to the people closest to him. Sometimes it is what he builds in silence, what he gives without applause. And so, as I lay there with my grandson's words still pressing against me, I realized something. He did not know. None of them did. To them I was diminished, small, almost invisible. But beyond their narrow vision, a building already stood, one that bore the weight of my true manhood, a place where people lived because I had refused to spend my life only on myself. They could not see it yet, but the day would come when they would. And when that moment arrived, the stone in my chest would no longer be pain. It would be the proof they had tried to erase, rising higher than their insults, stronger than their silence. Long before the insult, long before the night when my grandson's words carved through me, I had walked the quiet corridors of unfinished walls. I can still see the outlines of the clinic as it rose, slow and steady, against the skyline of our town. It was not just money I gave, it was my time, my energy, my very breath. I wasn't a man who stood on the sidelines watching others build. I was there at every step, making sure that what I dreamed of would stand strong long after I was gone. I remember the days when the blueprints lay spread across my table, late into the night, while the rest of the house slept. My hands traced the lines not as an architect, but as someone who knew what those lines would one day mean. A surgery room where a mother would cry tears of relief instead of despair. A waiting room where families would hold one another, praying, hoping, and sometimes receiving the miracle they needed. A wing for children, painted in soft colors, where laughter would chase away fear. Every check I signed was not ink on paper. It was blood from my veins, years of labor translated into hope for strangers I would never meet. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand, the trembling in my fingers as I calculated what I could give, and then gave more than was wise. I knew it meant less for myself, but I also knew it meant life for someone else. And wasn't that the measure of a man? Not what he kept, but what he gave away. There were meetings with doctors, quiet and serious. They spoke of equipment, of training, of needs that stretched further than I could imagine. And I listened, not as someone looking for recognition, but as someone who wanted to understand how best to serve. I asked them what mattered most, where the real healing would begin, and I promised them I would find a way. They looked at me with gratitude, sometimes even confusion, wondering why I wanted nothing in return. I told them the truth. I had already been given enough. I wanted to leave behind something that outlived my name. Yet I hid all of this from my family, not because I feared their judgment, but because I did not want the gift to turn into a weapon in arguments or a badge of pride hung around my neck. I wanted no applause at the dinner table, no empty praise. If they thought I was wasting my days, let them think it. My work was not for them to admire. It was for the ones who would walk through those clinic doors and find help when they had nowhere else to go. And still, as I lay in bed with the echo of my grandson's words burning in me, I felt the sting of the hidden truth. They thought me weak, small, and useless, when in reality my fingerprints were pressed into every brick of that building. My sweat had seeped into its foundation. My sacrifices were mixed into the mortar. And one day, when the doors opened and the people walked in, the world would see what they had missed all along, that I was not just a man, but the man who gave them this chance. That thought didn't erase the pain, but it steadied me, because I knew in time, truth always rises. A building stands taller than gossip, and brick by brick my story had already been written in stone. The sound of laughter came not from joy, but from cruelty. My grandson's voice carried from the next room, sharp with mockery, joined by the careless chuckles of his friends. They spoke of me as if I were a relic left too long on a shelf, something dusty, weak, and purposeless. "The old man without strength," one of them said, and though I knew those words were aimed to amuse, they landed on me like stones. Each syllable pressed down, heavier than the last, until I could almost feel the weight pulling me into the floor. I sat in my chair, silent, staring at the same hands that once carried timber, lifted steel, signed contracts, and wrote plans that others now lived from. These were not the hands of weakness. They were the hands that built futures. But to his young eyes, to their shallow laughter, they were only the hands of age, trembling, lined, no longer capable of holding power. They could not see the invisible strength that had already poured itself out for decades. To them, strength was in noise and display and showing dominance. To me, strength had always been in sacrifice. My son heard the laughter too, but his silence cut me deeper than the mockery itself. He did not stop them, did not defend me, did not remind his son that the chair I sat on, the roof over our heads, and even the privileges they mocked me from were all built by these same withered hands. His silence was not just an absence of words, it was agreement. And in that agreement, I felt the sharp edge of betrayal once more. I could have shouted. I could have stood up and demanded respect. But what would that have proven? Respect forced by anger lasts only as long as the echo of the voice. I did not want to be heard because I shouted the loudest. I wanted to be seen because truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. And so I said nothing. My lips stayed closed, my head remained bowed, but within me a fire that had long burned quietly began to rise. I thought of the clinic again, its white walls waiting for the first patients, its halls waiting to be filled with footsteps. I thought of the lives it would touch, the children who would cry their first cries there, the sick who would find healing under its roof. None of the boys laughing now had any idea that the old man without strength had laid that foundation. None of them knew that their laughter was directed at the very person whose shadow would one day shield them. And in that realization my resolve grew solid, unshakable. Their laughter could not diminish me. Their ignorance could not erase the truth. The rift between us was wide, a canyon carved by pride, blindness, and the arrogance of youth. But on my side of that canyon stood a lifetime of work, of sacrifice, of proof they had yet to see. So I sat in silence, but inside I made a vow. One day my grandson would see with his own eyes what strength truly looked like. Not the strength of muscle, not the loudness of boys mocking in the dark, but the strength of a man who gave without demanding, who built without boasting, who carried generations on his back while they laughed at the weight he bore. Their laughter faded, but my resolve remained, echoing louder than their words ever could. There comes a point when words lose their power. I had spoken enough in my life. Guided teams, advised my son, whispered bedtime stories to the same boy who now mocked me. Words had once built bridges, but now, in this house, they were nothing but dust scattered into silence. When my grandson laughed, when my son averted his eyes, I realized that nothing I said would change the image they had built of me. To them, I was already small, already diminished. No voice could climb over that wall. So I made a choice, not to fight with raised tones or plead with explanations. A man does not need to declare his worth. He only needs to let truth reveal itself. I decided in that moment that the time had come to show him, not through speeches, not through arguments, but through what already existed, what stood solid in brick and steel because of my hands and my sacrifices. The clinic, hidden until now, would become the answer to the question he didn't even know he was asking. I imagined his face the day he would step into that building, expecting nothing, seeing everything. The walls would speak louder than I ever could. The equipment gleaming in its halls, the doctors shaking his hand, the patients whose lives were saved, all of it would bear witness to the truth. He would not hear me telling him I was a man. He would see it, feel it, be unable to deny it. And when he finally understood, he would know that the strength he ridiculed was the strength that built the very ground beneath him. It wasn't an act of revenge I planned, but of revelation. My grandson didn't need punishment, he needed clarity. He needed to see what true manhood meant. Not the shallow bravado of laughter with friends, not the cruelty of words meant to wound, but the quiet, unshakable resolve of a life lived for others. The clinic was more than a building. It was proof that sacrifice is strength, that dignity is carved not in shouts, but in actions that outlast the voice that made them. That night, as I lay awake, I did not feel rage. I felt a calmness, a steady fire that did not burn wildly but warmed me from within. I thought of the faces of those who would one day thank me, faces my grandson did not yet see. I thought of the nurses who would walk the halls, of the children who would run again after illness, of the families who would cling to hope because someone they never met had believed enough to give. That was my answer. That was my truth. So I kept silent in the house. But within me, the decision was clear. I would not tell him. I would show him. And when the time came, the truth would rise like dawn, undeniable, unstoppable, shining brighter than any words ever could. The next morning, I did not announce my plan with fanfare, nor did I try to sweeten it with promises. I simply asked my grandson to walk with me. His eyes rolled, his shoulders slouched, his sigh heavy with the impatience of youth. He thought he knew what awaited him, another lecture, another story from a man he had already labeled irrelevant. Yet he came, dragging his feet beside mine, his every step carrying reluctance. We walked without words. The air between us was thick, but not with anger, with the quiet weight of what was about to unfold. My grandson glanced at me occasionally, puzzled by my silence. Perhaps he expected me to scold him, to press him with questions about respect and family, to unleash the words I had held back the night before. But I said nothing. The silence was deliberate, like the final moments before a curtain rises on a stage. In my pocket, my fingers pressed around the small, heavy key. Its edges dug into my palm, anchoring me, reminding me of what waited ahead. That key was more than metal. It was proof, a door to the truth, a quiet testament to years of sacrifice no one in my family had ever seen. I had carried it with me countless times, but today it burned differently. Today it was a weapon, though not of harm. It was a lantern meant to burn away ignorance. The boy walked beside me, his steps quick, eager to get the ordeal over with. He thought this was just another errand, another boring walk with the grandfather he dismissed as weak. His eyes stayed on his phone at times, his ears deaf to the world around him. But I did not rush. I let each step fall heavy, steady, purposeful. For me, this road was not just a path across town. It was the journey from shame to revelation. As we turned the last corner, the building came into view. Its brick walls rose against the sky with quiet dignity, not extravagant, but strong, purposeful, alive. To my grandson, it was just another structure, another box of stone and glass. He had no idea what it contained, no idea of the years poured into its foundations, no idea that this place was, in many ways, my life carved into brick. Still, I said nothing. I wanted the silence to do its work. Silence has a way of sharpening the senses, of preparing the soul to see more clearly. Words could spoil the moment. Explanations could cheapen the revelation. The truth needed no introduction. It only needed a door, a key, and the courage to let him step inside. The boy frowned, confused now, slowing his pace as he glanced at me, then at the building. He muttered something under his breath, impatience, perhaps, or annoyance, but I remained calm, holding the key tightly, almost as if I was squeezing all the years of my life into it. Soon I would place it into the lock, and in that simple turn, a world would open. Not just a clinic, but a lesson written in steel, glass, and human lives. And when that lock clicked open, there would be no going back. The key turned with a soft metallic echo, and the heavy door yielded as if it had been waiting for this very moment. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my grandson trailing behind me, his brows furrowed, his curiosity still hidden beneath a mask of irritation. He expected nothing. Perhaps a warehouse, perhaps some dusty relic of my past. He had no idea what awaited him within those walls. The first breath inside told a story louder than any speech I could ever give. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of antiseptics, the unmistakable fragrance of healing. White walls stretched down long corridors, not sterile in their emptiness, but alive with movement, with purpose. Nurses moved briskly from one room to another. Doctors consulted in hushed voices. The low hum of medical machinery filled the silence. These were not just walls. They were arteries, pulsing with life, carrying hope to every corner. My grandson stopped in the entryway, his footsteps halting as if the weight of the place pressed down on him. He glanced around, his mouth parting in slight confusion. Patients lined the halls, some waiting, some walking with hesitant steps, some sitting quietly with eyes full of worry. Mothers held children close. Men stared out of windows with faces marked by struggle, and yet everywhere I looked, there was also resilience, a stubborn flame of survival. He turned to me, his eyes asking the question he could not yet form. Why here? Why bring him to this place of illness, of quiet suffering? He did not understand that within these walls manhood was not proven by loudness or strength or the empty pride of youth. It was proven by service, by sacrifice, by giving of oneself until nothing was left but the legacy of what you had built. As we walked further, I let the walls speak. Each step revealed more. Rows of beds where patients rested, rooms where doctors worked late into the night, small desks where nurses recorded every detail of healing. There were no grand banners with my name, no portraits hanging in pride. That had never been the point. The proof of my life's work was etched in every sigh of relief when a diagnosis turned hopeful, in every hand that trembled less after being held by another. My grandson looked uncomfortable, as though he had stumbled into a world far heavier than he wanted to carry. His laughter from the night before, the cruel taunt of "not a real man," echoed back in his own ears now, though he did not say it aloud. Here, in these corridors, those words began to rot, because around him strangers were alive thanks to sacrifices he had never seen. I placed my hand lightly on the wall, my palm against the cool paint. I remembered the day the final coat had dried, the day I had stood here alone, imagining what it would become. I had walked these halls countless times before, but never like this. Never with the one person who most needed to see it. The walls were not silent. They whispered with every step. This was built. This was given. This was sacrifice. This is strength. And though my grandson did not yet fully understand, I saw the first crack in his certainty, the faint beginning of recognition. I still said nothing. I didn't need to. The walls were speaking for me. The corridor narrowed into a quieter space, a place where footsteps softened, and voices seemed to bow themselves into reverence. I slowed my pace, letting my grandson's impatience tug at his shoulders as he followed reluctantly. His eyes wandered, still searching for the meaning of this visit, still certain that nothing within these walls could possibly rewrite the image he held of me. And then he saw it. The plaque hung without fanfare, without garlands or decoration, bolted onto the wall with the same quiet dignity with which the building itself had been raised. No spotlight shone upon it, no guide pointed it out. It was there, waiting patiently for eyes willing to see. Bronze, modest, weathered by years of air and touch, it bore the truth I had never spoken. This clinic was built through the generosity of his name, my name. Not hidden in footnotes, not buried in some forgotten record, but cast in metal, etched letter by letter, unerasable. My grandson stopped mid-step. His gaze locked on the plaque, and his lips parted as though the words themselves had punched the breath from his chest. He leaned closer, as if he doubted his own eyes, tracing the letters silently with his stare. All the bravado of youth, the mockery, the arrogance, the careless cruelty, seemed to crack in that single moment. Here, in front of him, was proof that what he dismissed as weakness was in fact strength greater than anything he yet understood. He had mocked my hands as frail, my body as slow, my presence as unnecessary. But now, those same hands had been revealed as the foundation on which this place stood. Those same years of silence, now shown as sacrifice for the sake of strangers who would never know my name unless they stopped to read. I said nothing, The silence stretched between us like a rope, taut and unbroken. I let the bronze do the talking, let the truth shine without needing my defense. Because the power of that plaque was not just in the words written, but in the weight of everything they carried. Years of late nights, paychecks given away quietly, careful planning that no one ever saw. Around us, life continued. Nurses passed with clipboards. A child laughed faintly from a nearby room. A man in a wheelchair rolled slowly by. Each one of them, whether they knew it or not, bore a piece of that plaque in their story. My grandson's eyes followed them now, and I watched as he began to piece together what those letters meant. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't about recognition. It was about lives preserved, about futures protected, about battles fought not with fists or boasts, but with persistence and giving. For the first time since those cutting words, "You're not a real man," I saw his posture falter. His shoulders sagged slightly, his jaw softened, his bravado dimmed. The plaque had struck him deeper than I ever could. He could not argue with it. He could not laugh it away. Bronze did not bend for the arrogance of youth. I kept my hands folded calmly, my voice still sealed. Inside me the ache of his words was still alive, but now it pulsed with something steadier, something like justice. Not the justice of revenge, but the justice of truth, finally unveiled. My grandson was staring not at a man he thought was diminished, but at proof of what manhood truly meant. And in that hallway, surrounded by the quiet hum of healing, he finally saw me, not just his grandfather, not just an old man, but the builder of something that would outlast us both. The silence of the hallway broke when footsteps, firm and deliberate, echoed against the polished floor. A man in a white coat approached, his presence carrying the weight of authority, yet softened by the gentleness of someone who had spent years among suffering and healing. His face was lined not only with age, but with responsibility, with the knowledge of lives carried on his shoulders. He saw me, and before saying a word, his expression changed. Respect flickered first in his eyes, then deepened into something more. Recognition. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with warmth, "I didn't expect to see you here today." He didn't look at my grandson. He looked only at me, as though the boy were invisible in that moment, as though the years of dismissal and mockery no longer mattered in the presence of truth. "I have wanted for a long time to thank you." My grandson shifted uncomfortably beside me. His bravado had already cracked, but now it began to crumble. He looked between the doctor and me, confusion etched across his face. He had expected this visit to be some lecture, some attempt to prove worth with empty words. But here was someone who held no reason to flatter, no motive to lie, only truth spoken plainly. The doctor continued, his voice carrying down the corridor, not loud, but strong enough for others nearby to hear. "This clinic, it would not stand without you. Do you know how many children have come through these doors, desperate for help their families could not afford? Do you know how many mothers have held their newborns here, alive because of the work that began with your sacrifice? Hundreds, perhaps thousands. You gave them that chance." Every word was like a nail driven into the flimsy wall my grandson had built with his insult. The wall of arrogance, of ignorance, of careless cruelty, each sentence hammered deeper until there was nothing left to hide behind. The doctor's gaze did not waver. It was not the gaze of a man handing out polite gratitude. It was the gaze of someone who had seen, firsthand, the reach of what one man's unseen generosity could accomplish. I stood still, my hands folded in front of me, my chest rising slowly with each breath. I didn't speak, because I didn't need to. The doctor's words were building the portrait that I had never painted for myself, the truth I had kept hidden out of humility, and my grandson, who once laughed at me, was forced to witness it, not as a story, not as a claim, but as undeniable testimony. The doctor went on, "Every hallway here carries your mark, every bed that has held a sick child, every recovery, every life saved, it traces back to you. You may not see the faces of those who were healed, but I do, and I will never forget who made this place possible." My grandson's face changed in that moment. His eyes darted to mine, then back to the plaque on the wall, then to the doctor again. The boy who once saw me as frail, as obsolete, was now staring at me as though I were someone he had never met. His lips trembled, though no words came. Around us, a few staff members paused, listening, realizing who I was. One nurse lowered her head respectfully as she passed. Another smiled faintly, as if recognizing an old friend. Each small gesture pressed deeper into my grandson's heart, painting the truth more vividly than any argument I could ever make. And I remained silent, because justice, when it comes quietly, is more powerful than any shout. I didn't need to defend myself. The lives that had been saved spoke louder than my voice ever could. That day, in the sterile brightness of a clinic hallway, my grandson began to understand that manhood is not about noise, not about dominance, not about forcing others to see you. It is about the quiet work that changes the world when no one is watching. And for the first time I felt his eyes on me, not with contempt, but with something dangerously close to reverence. For a long moment, the boy stood there, as if rooted to the floor, his sneakers squeaking faintly when he shifted his weight, but no sound rising from his throat. The same mouth that had once curled in mockery, the same lips that had hurled careless insults, now refused to obey him. Pride had built a fortress around his heart, brick by brick, each stone laid with the certainty of youth that believes it already understands the world. But here, in the brightness of the clinic that bore my unseen signature, those walls began to collapse, silently but irreversibly. He glanced at the plaque again, his eyes moving slowly over the engraved letters. My name, the name he had mocked, dismissed, forgotten, stood carved into the wall, harder than his laughter, stronger than his disbelief. His shoulders, once squared in arrogance, began to sink, as though the weight of truth was pressing down on them, reminding him of how small his words had always been. He looked at me then, not the way a grandson looks at a grandfather, but the way a student looks at a teacher after realizing how much of the lesson had been missed. The boy's chest rose and fell too quickly. He swallowed hard, but the apology, if it hovered on his lips, never escaped. For apologies require courage, and courage was something pride had stolen from him. Instead, he stood there in silence, the cracks in his armor widening with every second, shame bleeding through like water through fractured stone. And I watched him, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with the patience of someone who has weathered too many storms to take pleasure in the sight of another bending in the wind. I knew this was not the end of his journey. This was only the first fracture. Broken pride is not healed in a moment. It lingers, stings, forces a soul to face itself in ways it never wanted to. The clinic hummed around us, the soft murmur of voices, the shuffle of footsteps, the beeping of machines, all reminders that life was moving forward, being mended, being saved. And in that hum, the boy's silence screamed louder than his insult ever had. His eyes searched mine, desperate for an anchor, for something steady to hold on to in the storm that was now his own undoing. He realized then, perhaps for the first time, that real strength had nothing to do with the sharpness of his words or the volume of his laughter. Real strength was the quiet persistence that lays bricks when no one claps, that signs checks in the dark, that builds walls to shelter strangers without expecting thanks. Real strength was sacrifice that never demanded recognition, the very thing he had mocked as weakness. And though he said nothing, I could feel the shift in him, the trembling of his fingers, the slight bend of his knees, the way his gaze could no longer hold mine for long without faltering. It was all there. The breaking had begun. The boy who once towered over me in his pride was now small, not because I diminished him, but because the truth finally revealed the measure of a man. I let him stand in that silence, because sometimes the greatest lessons are not taught with words, but with the weight of reality pressing against the heart until it bends. And in that silence, I knew his pride had shattered. And in its ruins, something new might finally grow. Evening came quietly, painting the sky in slow strokes of amber and violet. The city lights blinked awake one by one, as though the earth itself was taking a breath after a long day. I sat on the worn wooden bench just outside the clinic, the same clinic whose foundations I had carried in silence for years. The hum of life from within drifted out into the night. Footsteps, muffled voices, the faint echo of laughter mixed with sobs of relief. each sound a testament to the purpose I had hidden in my chest all this time. My hands rested on my knees, scarred and tired hands that had known both labor and loss, both building and letting go. Beside me sat my grandson, not hunched forward with arrogance, not smirking with easy superiority, but quiet, still. His shoulders, once carried high with careless pride, now leaned slightly toward me, as if the bench itself demanded he draw nearer. He didn't look at me at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the doors of the clinic, where patients walked in, where nurses guided children, where hope moved freely in and out like air. And in that silence, something heavier than words passed between us. The boy who had once called me not a real man no longer needed to speak. His silence was no longer defiance, it was reverence. His eyes told the story for him, wide, uncertain, but softened with something that had not been there before, respect, maybe even shame, perhaps the first fragile root of understanding. I breathed deeply, the evening air cool in my lungs, and felt a strange calm. Not victory. Victory is noisy, it shouts, it demands recognition. What I felt was different. It was dignity, simple and unshaken. The kind of dignity that doesn't need applause, that doesn't need to defend itself anymore. The kind that comes when the truth has already risen on its own, unforced, undeniable. I thought of the words that had wounded me so deeply. Not a real man. I thought of the laughter that had followed, of the silence from those who should have defended me, of the long nights I spent with that phrase echoing in my chest like a stone dropped into a well. And now, sitting there with my grandson by my side, I realized those words no longer had power. They had crumbled in the face of what was real, what could not be erased, the walls of the clinic, the patients inside, the plaque on the wall with my name carved into history. The boy shifted, finally turning to glance at me. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. His throat worked, his eyes glassy, and I did not need to hear his apology. It was already in his gaze. Sometimes an apology is not a sentence, but a silence heavy enough to break a heart open. I placed my hand on the bench between us, not reaching for him, not demanding closeness, but leaving the space open, an invitation. He hesitated, then let his fingers brush against the wood where mine rested. It was small, tentative, but it was enough. The stars began to pierce the sky, faint but steady. I lifted my face toward them, and in that moment I felt the weight of justice settle, not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as balance. The scales had tipped quietly, without force, without shouting, without me demanding anything. Truth had risen like dawn, slow but unstoppable, and with it came a peace deeper than any vindication could ever give. From that night forward, I knew one thing. Never again would anyone, least of all my grandson, dare to call me less than a man. They had seen the truth. They had walked into the walls I built with my hidden labor. They had breathed the air of the rooms I had given my strength to. They had looked into the faces of those who lived because of what I had done. No insult could erase that. No laughter could drown it out. No silence could bury it again. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment as the night grew darker, and in the quiet beside me I felt not weakness, not rejection, but something stronger than both, the slow, patient recognition of a legacy. My grandson sat still, no longer mocking, no longer blind, and I no longer needed words. My life had already spoken for me. And so with dignity as my companion, I let the night carry us forward. Justice had not come in anger. It had come in truth, and truth was enough.